And while Detroit's financial emergency played out and Kevin Orr filed for bankruptcy, there was a mayoral race going on. Mike Duggan, former Detroit Medical Center CEO, was on the ballot, then off the ballot because of residency issues, and then on again after winning a stunning write-in campaign in the primary. He beat Benny Napoleon in the general election, but is now still trying to figure out what kind of role he will play as mayor in a city that's being run by an emergency manager.
What would you say is the most important thing for you to have some say over come January?
Well, I don't think there's any question the driving issue in the city is public safety, and we have got to go after the police response time. But those are things that we're still working through, and whether I will be responsible for public safety or not is something that has not been resolved. So, we're going through it, issue by issue, and hopefully in the next 2 weeks we'll have a formal agreement that would get reduced to an order that the emergency manager would enter.
So when you think about what a COO would do, what's it look like to you, and what would the plus be?
Well, I'm not sure what the plus is, but I spent 14 years as a deputy county executive. I was a COO, so I know exactly what a COO is. But I want the ability to go in and deal with the fact that these street light repairs are too darn slow. I want to be able to straighten out. Right now, we got about 7 different cooks in the blight kitchen. We need to have a single blight strategy, and I had the opportunity to sit down with Dan Gilbert in the last week. What he's doing on the Blight Authority is just phenomenal. If we can corral all the different people doing things and go to a single Department of Neighborhoods, as I outlined in the campaign, I think we can make an impact on the quality of life of the neighborhoods in the first year. So I want to have enough authority to be able to do those things, respecting that I'm going to have to operate within Mr. Orr's budget. I have to operate in a way that does not disrupt what's going on in his litigation bankruptcy. And to the extent he's set up frameworks and collective bargaining agreements, or to the extent he wants to sign off on major appointments, those things are all fine. And so something along those lines could conceivably work. So
you mentioned collective bargaining agreements. Should you be the one negotiating with the union, since you're the one who's going to have to live with the contracts long term?
There's 2 ways to look at it. One is that the emergency manager is putting forward a plan of adjustment to the bankruptcy court, which has to be accepted by the judge, and we don't get out of bankruptcy. And so he certainly has an intense interest in making sure that those agreements fit within his parameters. I have an intense agreement to make sure that we can afford them in the long run. So our interests are probably aligned. But if I were the emergency manager, I would want to sign off on these agreements because I've got an obligation to live up to my representations to the court. So those kinds of conversations are the kinds of discussions we're having. They're all professional, they're all rational, but it's very complicated and it's very detailed. We're trying to work through it.
Are you talking principally with Kevin, or are you also talking with Governor Snyder, who I know wants to have a pretty active role in shaping this partnership?
I'm talking to both, but it's very clear that the emergency manager is in charge, and just as the statute suggests, he really is in charge, and ultimately I believe the emergency manager is going to decide what it looks like.
So you don't get a sense that Lansing's pulling the strings and calling the shots here?
It's hard for me to tell what goes on when I'm not in the room, but my conversations with the governor have been very constructive, and I see lots of ways for the city and state to partner, and I feel very good about that.
What about talent? We hired a new CFO last week. It seemed like somebody who we should be pleased to see come to Detroit, but it also seemed pretty clear that was Kevin's pick.
I would not, again, I don't think so. I think the CFO worked out ideally, which is I sat in on the main interview. I was totally impressed. I spent 2 hours with him. And after an hour, I said to him, I don't want you to think of this in terms of 6 months or 8 months for an emergency manager. I'd like you to think in terms of being the CFO for the next 4 years. Mr. Hill is just phenomenal. He headed up the oversight board when Washington, D.C. Was under an emergency manager. He talked to me about how he got citizens positively engaged, which is something I've seen lacking here in our particular situation. But I've dealt with a lot of CFOs both in the private sector and the public sector, and Mr. Hill was far better than what I would have expected us to be able to attract as a public sector CFO. So we made the offer together. My understanding is Mr. Hill insisted on hearing from me before he made a decision, and so the reason that we announced it jointly was Mr. Orr has indicated he wants him here for his tenure. I've indicated to Mr. Hill I want him here for my tenure, and this truly was an example of what working together could produce.
What about talent and the rest of the administration? I mean, you've got a lot of jobs to fill. It's unclear as of yet, I guess, how many of them that that you'll get to fill by January. How's that all going?
You know, we've got a transition office open in Cadillac Towers. There's a dozen people working, 60 and 80-hour weeks assessing that talent and the like. And so we'll know the details, but obviously I expect to be the person primarily recruiting the cabinet. We have got to shift from this consultant-based government that we have today to getting the permanent people in place who are going to start to run the departments.
So if you were given a larger role, do you believe you could get rid of some of those consultants who are quite expensive for the city? Do you think you can replace them with folks who might serve you long term?
I think we need to start transitioning down so that every month that goes by on the operational side, I'm not talking about the ones supporting the bankruptcy litigation, but the consultants supporting the day-to-day operations, I'd like to see us to start to phase down that money and put your money into the permanent people who will be running the departments. And yes, I do think I can phase it down.